2:58 a.m., November 9th, 1979.
Perform EWO emergency LF evacuation.
We have an EWO evac.
Inside a secure command center deep beneath Cheyenne Mountain, warning screens suddenly lit up. Incoming missile trajectories, hundreds of them. The computers showed a massive Soviet nuclear strike headed toward the United States. The countdown to retaliation began. Military officers stared at glowing radar displays. The data suggested submarine-launched ballistic missiles had already been fired. Intercontinental ballistic missiles were on their way. Targets across American cities appeared on the screen: Washington, New York, Chicago, missile silos in the Midwest. In a matter of seconds, the unthinkable seemed to be happening. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, had trained for this exact moment for decades. Every drill, every simulation, every sleepless overnight watch had prepared them for a Soviet first strike. And now, the screen said it was real. Emergency procedures activated. Strategic Air Command was notified. Nuclear bomber crews were placed on alert. Missile crews in underground silos prepared for potential launch orders. The National Military Command Center in the Pentagon received the warning. There were only minutes to decide. If the United States responded incorrectly, it would trigger a full-scale nuclear war. If it hesitated and the attack was real, the country could be destroyed without retaliation. This was not a drill. At least, that's what the computers said. The Cold War had been simmering for more than 3 decades. Since the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union had built arsenals capable of destroying the planet many times over. By 1979, both nations maintained thousands of nuclear warheads, many ready to launch within minutes. Mutually assured destruction was the doctrine. If one side launched, the other would retaliate. No one would win. The entire strategy depended on early warning systems working perfectly. Radar installations scanned the Arctic skies. Satellites monitored missile launches. Massive computers processed incoming data to determine whether an attack was real. On that early November morning, those systems indicated catastrophe. Inside Cheyenne Mountain, officers began verifying the data. They cross-checked radar feeds. They consulted other detection systems. Early warning satellites, designed to detect the heat signature of missile launches, showed nothing. That was strange. Ground radar stations also reported no confirmations of incoming missiles. Yet the main display continued to show a full-scale attack. Hundreds of warheads. Time was passing. In the Pentagon, senior officials were awakened and rushed into position. Strategic bombers were prepared for takeoff. Some crews were already in cockpits, engines warming. The United States was inches from launching a nuclear counterstrike. And then, something didn't add up. The raw radar data did not match the computer projections. The satellites saw no infrared signatures. No independent confirmation existed outside the simulation system. Within minutes, officers realized the horrifying truth. The attack wasn't real. A training scenario, a simulation tape used for drills, had somehow been loaded into the live warning system. The computer believed it was under attack because it had been fed a practice scenario. The United States nearly launched nuclear weapons because of a training error. But this wasn't the only time. Throughout the Cold War, there were multiple moments when the world came dangerously close to nuclear war. Not because of deliberate aggression, but because of misunderstandings, technical glitches, or human error. The system that was designed to prevent surprise attacks was also capable of triggering catastrophe. To understand how close the United States truly came, you have to understand the machinery behind the warning. Deep beneath Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, NORAD operated inside a hardened bunker built to survive a nuclear blast. Massive steel blast doors sealed the entrance. The facility was designed to withstand shock waves, electromagnetic pulses, even nearby detonations. Inside, teams monitored radar arrays stretching across North America. These included the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, giant radar installations positioned to detect missiles launched over the Arctic. In addition, satellites known as DSP, Defense Support Program satellites, orbited the Earth, scanning for the heat plumes of rocket launches. These systems fed data into powerful mainframe computers. In the 1970s, those computers were cutting-edge, but primitive by today's standards. They relied on magnetic tapes, punch cards, and limited memory capacity. Simulations were routinely run to ensure readiness. Crews trained constantly for nuclear war scenarios. On November 9, 1979, a technician inserted a simulation tape, likely for a routine training exercise. Somehow, that tape was fed into the operational system. The screens displayed a full Soviet strike, and because the Cold War climate was tense, the warning was taken seriously. Just months earlier, tensions between Washington and Moscow had escalated over arms negotiations and geopolitical conflicts. Trust was fragile. Military exercises were often interpreted as potential threats. In such an environment, a computer glitch was not easily dismissed. The 1979 incident forced a full review of procedures. Officials publicly downplayed the severity, but privately, the implications were terrifying. If a training tape could almost trigger nuclear retaliation, what else could go wrong? It turned out, quite a lot. On June 3, 1980, less than a year later, warning systems again indicated incoming missiles. This time, the displays showed a smaller number. First 2 missiles, then 200, then 0, fluctuating unpredictably. Once again, bomber crews prepared. Once again, officials scrambled. The cause? A failed computer chip worth less than $1. A malfunctioning integrated circuit generated random numbers that the system interpreted as missile counts. The fate of millions had momentarily depended on a defective microchip. These incidents revealed a frightening truth. The early warning system was only as reliable as its weakest component. And in the nuclear age, even a minor malfunction could escalate beyond control. But perhaps the most sobering moment of the Cold War did not happen inside an American bunker. It happened on September 26, 1983, inside a Soviet early warning facility. Shortly after midnight, Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov was on duty when alarms sounded. The system reported that the United States had launched 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles toward the Soviet Union. Protocol required him to report the launch immediately. Retaliation could follow. But something didn't feel right. The system indicated only 5 missiles. An American first strike would likely involve hundreds. Petrov hesitated. He judged the warning to be a false alarm. He was correct. Sunlight reflecting off clouds had fooled the satellite sensors. Had Petrov followed procedure without question, the Soviet Union might have launched nuclear missiles in response. The world survived because one man doubted a computer. Back in the United States, officials quietly strengthened safeguards after the 1979 and 1980 incidents. Systems were separated more carefully. Training simulations were more tightly controlled. Redundancies were added. But the underlying dilemma remained. Nuclear deterrence required speed. Speed reduced time for verification, and reduced time increased risk. During the Cold War, decision-makers often had less than 10 minutes to determine whether radar blips represented Armageddon. Imagine being awakened at 3 a.m., told that hundreds of warheads were inbound, and being asked to decide whether to launch a counterstrike that could end civilization, all within minutes. That pressure defined the era. Americans living in the 1970s and 1980s grew up with air raid sirens, civil defense drills, and nightly news coverage of escalating tensions. The threat of nuclear war was not abstract. It was immediate. Yet few knew how fragile the warning systems actually were. The public believed in precision, in flawless radar and infallible computers. Behind the scenes, technicians wrestled with aging hardware, software limitations, and human error. The November 1979 incident was not widely understood at the time. Reports emerged gradually. Congressional investigations examined the flaws. Officials assured the public that safeguards were improved. But the reality remained unsettling. For a brief window of time, the United States believed it was under nuclear attack, and the only thing that prevented catastrophe was cross-checking data before pressing a button. In an age before the internet, before smartphones, before real-time global communication, those decisions were made in isolated command centers by small groups of officers relying on blinking screens and paper printouts. The Cold War was often portrayed as a chess match between superpowers, but sometimes it came down to a faulty tape drive, or a damaged chip, or a skeptical human being refusing to accept what a computer displayed. And as the 1979 false alarm faded from headlines, the systems remained on alert, every hour of every day.
waiting, watching, ready to decide the fate of the world in minutes. The question was never just whether missiles would fly, it was whether the warning system itself could be trusted. And history shows that trust was tested more than once. In the years that followed the 1979 false alarm, military planners faced a paradox they could never fully solve.
The entire nuclear strategy of the United States depended on speed. If a surprise attack destroyed American missiles on the ground, the country could lose its ability to retaliate. That vulnerability was known as a decapitation strike. An attack meant to cripple command and control before leaders could respond. To prevent that, the United States adopted what was known as launch on warning. If incoming missiles were detected, the president could order a counterstrike before enemy warheads even landed. That meant the decision window could be as short as 6 to 12 minutes. Think about that. 6 minutes to confirm radar data. 6 minutes to wake the president. 6 minutes to verify intelligence. 6 minutes to choose whether to begin a nuclear war. And those minutes were often filled with uncertainty. The early warning radars were powerful, but not perfect. Ballistic missiles launched from submarines could appear suddenly on radar screens with very little warning. Atmospheric conditions sometimes distorted signals. Technical malfunctions occasionally created phantom blips. Computers were programmed to interpret patterns. If certain criteria were met, number of objects, trajectory angles, speeds, the system would flag a potential attack. But computers did not understand context. They did not understand politics. They did not understand human hesitation. They did not understand doubt. They only processed data. After the 1979 incident, engineers tried to make the system more resilient. Additional verification layers were introduced. Separate channels were created to ensure that training simulations could never again feed directly into live operational displays. But the fundamental structure remained the same. Detect, verify, decide. Behind the scenes, another critical system stood ready: the nuclear football. Wherever the president traveled, a military aide carried a briefcase containing authentication codes and communication tools required to authorize a nuclear launch. Inside that case were sealed cards with codes, known informally as the biscuit, used to confirm the president's identity. If a launch was ordered, the message would travel through secure channels to missile crews across the country. In underground silos scattered across the Great Plains, Air Force officers sat on constant alert. Each missile required 2 officers to turn keys simultaneously to initiate launch procedures. They trained repeatedly for that moment. During the November 1979 scare, many of those crews were placed on heightened alert. Bombers were readied. Communications lines were activated. Some accounts suggest that certain aircraft were even prepared for immediate takeoff, ready to disperse to avoid being destroyed on the ground. The public slept through it. Most Americans had no idea how close their country had come to responding to a non-existent attack. But inside command centers, the memory lingered. In the early 1980s, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union intensified once again. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the NATO deployment of intermediate-range missiles in Europe, and escalating rhetoric increased suspicion on both sides. Military exercises became flashpoints. In 1983, NATO conducted a command post exercise known as Able Archer 83. It simulated a transition from conventional war to nuclear release procedures. The exercise was designed as a drill, but Soviet intelligence reportedly misinterpreted it as possible preparation for a real first strike. Soviet forces reportedly heightened readiness in response. For a brief period, each side viewed the other's training as potential aggression. This was the razor's edge of the Cold War. Mistakes did not need to be malicious. They only needed to be misunderstood. False alarms continued to occur, though not always publicly disclosed. Technical malfunctions, satellite misreads, and data transmission errors occasionally triggered investigations. Every time an alarm sounded, the process repeated. Check satellite data. Check radar confirmation. Check secondary systems. Consult commanders. Notify leadership. The goal was to avoid panic, but also to avoid hesitation if the threat were real. This balancing act defined nuclear command and control. In private briefings, military officials acknowledged that no system could ever be entirely free from error. Complex systems fail in complex ways. A small wiring problem could create cascading alerts. A software bug could generate phantom numbers. Human fatigue could slow verification. And all of it unfolded under the pressure of potential annihilation. For those working overnight shifts in command bunkers, the psychological burden was immense. They knew that if a real attack occurred, millions could die within hours. They also knew that if they made the wrong call during a false alarm, they could trigger the very disaster they were trying to prevent. The November 1979 incident became a case study inside military academies. It was examined as an example of how procedures, not just technology, prevent catastrophe. The system worked that night because officers did not immediately accept the computer's conclusion. They demanded confirmation. They cross-checked sources. They questioned the data. That skepticism may have saved the world. But the margin was thin. As the Cold War moved toward its final decade, both superpowers continued modernizing their arsenals. Missiles became faster. Warheads became more accurate. Submarine fleets grew more sophisticated. Warning times did not expand. In fact, as submarine-launched ballistic missiles improved, they reduced warning time even further. A missile launched from a submarine positioned off the U.S. coast could reach targets in under 10 minutes. That reality meant that the president might have even less time to decide than in 1979. Some strategists argued for shifting away from launch on warning, advocating instead for absorbing a first strike and retaliating afterward. Others warned that doing so could risk losing deterrence entirely. The debate was never fully resolved. Meanwhile, technology advanced, but so did complexity. The more interconnected the systems became, the more potential points of failure existed. And yet, despite the false alarms, despite the close calls, nuclear war never occurred. Not in 1979, not in 1980, not in 1983. Each time, something interrupted the chain of escalation. Sometimes it was technology correcting itself. Sometimes it was human judgment. Sometimes it was simple delay. For the generation that lived through it, the Cold War was not just geopolitics. It was a constant background tension, a low hum of possibility. School children practiced drills. Families built backyard shelters. Television broadcasts discussed missile counts and arms treaties. And behind it all, hidden from public view, command centers waited for alarms that might never come, or might arrive without warning. The 1979 false alarm is often described as a glitch, but it was more than that. It was a demonstration of how fragile global stability could be. A training tape, a simulation, a mistaken input. And within minutes, the machinery of nuclear retaliation began to move. The world did not end that morning, but for a brief window in the darkness before dawn, the United States prepared as if it might. And the men inside Cheyenne Mountain understood something few others did. The greatest threat was not always an enemy missile. Sometimes, it was the system itself. And as long as nuclear weapons remained on alert, the possibility of another false alarm would never fully disappear. The screens would continue to glow. The radars would continue to scan. And somewhere, at some hour past midnight, someone would be watching, hoping that the next warning was only another mistake. By the mid-1980s, the United States had invested billions of dollars into making sure the events of November 9, 1979 could never happen again. New safeguards were written into protocol manuals. Simulation tapes were physically separated from live operational systems. Authentication procedures were tightened. Independent verification layers were expanded. But even with improvements, one uncomfortable reality remained. No early warning system could ever guarantee perfection. The structure of nuclear defense relied on overlapping technologies: ground-based radar, satellite detection, communication relays, encrypted authentication chains, and human confirmation at every level. Yet every layer introduced complexity, and complexity introduces risk. In 1995, Years after the Cold War had officially ended, a new incident proved that the danger had not disappeared. On January 25, 1995, Russian radar systems detected what appeared to be a missile launch off the coast of Norway. The trajectory resembled that of a submarine-launched ballistic missile that could deliver a high-altitude nuclear burst designed to disable Russian radar. Inside Moscow, alarms sounded. The Russian nuclear briefcase, the equivalent of the American football, was activated for the first time in history. President Boris Yeltsin was notified. For several tense minutes, Russian officials debated whether they were witnessing the opening move of a nuclear strike. The object on radar was actually a scientific research rocket launched by Norwegian and American scientists studying the aurora borealis. Russia had been informed of the launch in advance, but the message had not reached the correct channels. For several minutes, the world once again stood near the edge. This incident occurred after the Cold War had ended. It proved that the danger was not confined to ideological rivalry. It was embedded in the structure of nuclear deterrence itself. Back in the United States, the lessons of 1979 remain relevant. Cheyenne Mountain continued operations for decades, eventually transitioning some responsibilities to newer facilities. The Cold War bunker, carved into solid granite, symbolized an era of constant vigilance. Inside, the atmosphere had always been intense but controlled. Officers trained to suppress emotion. Procedures were drilled repeatedly to ensure muscle memory under stress. When the false alarm occurred in 1979, what prevented disaster was not advanced artificial intelligence or flawless hardware. It was discipline. It was hesitation. It was the refusal to act on incomplete information. The system required people willing to challenge the data. This principle, trust but verify, became central to nuclear command philosophy. Every alarm required confirmation from multiple independent sources. Satellite detection had to align with ground radar. Communications had to remain intact. Analysts had to assess plausibility. Would an adversary launch only 5 missiles? Would a strike come without political warning? Would intelligence channels show heightened activity beforehand? These questions bought time. Time was the most valuable resource in nuclear crisis management. In 1979, the cross-checking process exposed the error quickly enough. But imagine if satellite data had also glitched. Imagine if radar interference had coincided. Imagine if geopolitical tensions had been higher that week. The difference between false alarm and real launch often came down to context. Cold War historians later revealed that both the United States and the Soviet Union experienced dozens of false warnings over the decades. Most were minor. Some were serious. A few were terrifying. They were caused by everything from computer malfunctions to unusual cloud formations, to reflections from the moon, to faulty wiring, to human misinterpretation. The public rarely heard about them in real time. Governments feared that revealing how often systems failed could undermine confidence, or worse, create panic. But those inside the system understood the fragility. They understood that deterrence worked not because machines were perfect, but because people were cautious. As the 1980s progressed, arms control treaties attempted to reduce the number of weapons on hair-trigger alert. Agreements like the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty sought to remove certain missile classes entirely. Yet thousands of warheads remain deployed. Even today, decades later, many nuclear weapons remain capable of launch within minutes. Technology has improved. Computers are faster. Detection systems are more sophisticated. But the basic structure remains similar. Detect, verify, decide. The events of November 9, 1979, serve as a reminder that systems designed to protect can also endanger. They reveal how close humanity can come to irreversible decisions because of technical error. And they highlight a deeper truth about the nuclear age. The greatest power ever created by civilization depends on fallible tools and fallible people. In the early hours of that November morning, officers inside Cheyenne Mountain faced screens that told them their country was under attack. They followed procedure. They demanded confirmation. They resisted panic. Because of that, no missiles were launched. The sun rose as it always had. Americans woke up unaware that anything unusual had occurred. Traffic moved through city streets. Children went to school. Businesses opened. The world continued, unchanged on the surface. But beneath that normalcy lay the knowledge that stability was thinner than anyone imagined. A tape inserted into the wrong machine, a chip that failed, a reflection of sunlight, a research rocket mistaken for a weapon. Each incident whispered the same warning. Nuclear war does not always begin with intention. Sometimes, it begins with error. And as long as weapons remain poised for rapid launch, the line between mistake and catastrophe will always exist. The Cold War ended without the apocalypse many feared, but the systems built during that era did not disappear overnight. They evolved, they modernized, they persisted. The story of the 1979 false alarm is not simply a historical footnote. It is a reminder of how much depends on moments of doubt, on quiet decisions made in underground rooms, on individuals willing to question what the screen is telling them. Because in the nuclear age, survival has often depended less on power and more on restraint. Restraint is not dramatic. It does not make headlines. It does not come with celebration. It does not appear in history books with bold victories. But on November 9, 1979, restraint was the difference between continuation and catastrophe. When the screens inside Cheyenne Mountain lit up, the machinery of retaliation began to move exactly as it had been designed to move. Alerts were transmitted. Crews were notified. Strategic bombers were readied. Communication chains activated with precision. Nothing malfunctioned in the response. The failure had occurred earlier, quietly, invisibly, when a training simulation entered the wrong system. That is what makes the event so unsettling. The danger did not come from an enemy decision. It came from routine, from familiarity, from procedure, from the everyday operations of a massive defense apparatus. The Cold War is often remembered through dramatic moments: the Cuban Missile Crisis, Berlin, proxy wars overseas. But the 1979 false alarm reveals something subtler and perhaps more disturbing. It shows that even in the absence of confrontation, the world remained at risk. Not because leaders wanted war, but because systems were built to move quickly. Speed was considered strength. Automation was considered reliability. Readiness was considered security. Yet speed reduces deliberation. Automation reduces intuition. Readiness reduces margin. The officers who cross-checked the data that morning did something profoundly human. They paused. They noticed the satellite data did not match the projections. They saw that radar confirmation was missing. They questioned the assumption that an attack had begun. In those minutes, skepticism outweighed fear, and that hesitation preserved peace. It is tempting to view the survival of the Cold War as inevitable, to assume that because nuclear war did not happen, the system must have worked perfectly. History suggests otherwise. The system worked because individuals refused to let it operate blindly, because technicians verified, because analysts double-checked, because commanders waited for confirmation. The November 1979 incident forced leaders to confront a difficult truth. The safeguards designed to protect civilization could also endanger it if not constantly questioned. In response, procedures were revised. Redundancies were strengthened. Training protocols were separated from live systems. But no reform could eliminate uncertainty entirely. Even today, early warning systems remain active. Missile detection satellites still scan for infrared plumes. Radar arrays still sweep across the Arctic horizon. Command centers remain staffed around the clock. The architecture of deterrence continues, and with it, the same fundamental tension remains. The need to act quickly balanced against the need to be absolutely certain. The false alarm of 1979 did not trigger war. It did not produce explosions. It did not change borders. It did not appear on front pages the next morning. Its significance lies in what almost happened, in how close a chain reaction came to beginning, in how ordinary a mistake can become extraordinary when paired with irreversible power. For those who lived through the Cold War, the threat often felt distant yet constant, a shadow stretching across decades. But inside underground bunkers and command centers, that shadow was measured in minutes. 6 minutes, 10 minutes, sometimes less. Minutes in which the fate of cities, nations, and generations could be decided. On that November morning, the the decision was not to launch. Not because of luck alone, but because human beings, trained, disciplined, cautious, insisted on proof. That insistence prevented an irreversible act. The story endures as a quiet reminder that the stability of the nuclear age has never rested solely on weapons or treaties. It has rested on judgment, on doubt, on the willingness to question what appears certain. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. In a world equipped with extraordinary destructive power, survival has depended not on aggression, but on patience. Not on speed, but on verification. And not on machines, but on the people who choose when not to press the button.